Christmas is a time of peace and love with family and showing goodwill towards men. But in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War in 1865, it was a time of great uncertainty. As historian Stephen Hahn explains, the foundation of social relations, slavery, and the most recent structure of governance, the Confederacy, had almost simultaneously been destroyed. But no new social or political system had either quickly emerged or been imposed to replace them. Only the Union Army of Occupation held official political authority in most areas, and even then local commanders had much latitude in carrying out their still ambiguous assignment. With so much uncertainty and fear of the unknown because of being thrown into social and political situations unheard of in the South, paranoia spread. The white population of the former Confederacy believed that an insurrection was being planned by the newly freed slaves to rise up in a race war to exterminate whites and redistribute their land. The USCT, or United States Colored Troops, who occupied parts of the South, only added to that paranoia by putting weapons in the hands of and giving authority to a group of people who had previously not had that power. As best as historians can gather, the rumors of insurrection began around the coasts of North and South Carolina, which makes sense because South Carolina had an African American majority, and being outnumbered in an insurrection scenario does not bode well for that state's white population. Fear of the redistribution of land ran rampant throughout the South, and even Freedmen's Bureau's officials, who were there to help transition from slave society to free society, expected some form of redistribution of land to the newly freed peoples of the South. We have to remember, by the time the Civil War ended, owing to congressional legislation, military field orders, and wartime planter abandonment of land, the federal government controlled nearly 900,000 acres of southern land and had authority to set apart for eventual acquisition by loyal refugees and freedmen. Therefore, with congressional law on their side, the conquering Union possessed a legal right to take land away from the former Confederates. And to be clear, it was not simply whites who expected land to be taken away, but freedmen heard from multiple politicians, Union officials, and other African Americans that land would be provided to them. General Rufus Saxton, the Freedmen's Bureau Assistant Commissioner for South Carolina, Florida, and Georgia, explained that the freedmen heard from those in rebellion that it was the purpose of our government to divide up the southern plantations among them, and that was one of the reasons the rebels urged among their own people to excite them to greater activity. Our own acts of Congress, and particularly the one creating the Freedmen's Bureau, which was extensively circulated among them, further strengthened them in this dearest wish of their heart, that they would have homesteads. The general even saw that whites repeatedly speaking of the fear of their land being taken away was giving the freedmen more assurance that something along those lines would happen. The idea of land redistribution came from William T. Sherman's General Order No. 15, which basically allocated Georgia's coastal lands to the slaves who had followed his army through Georgia to the coast. Tens of thousands of additional people put a strain on Sherman's supply lines, and this order was more of a military necessity than a humanitarian effort because Sherman never thought of himself as an egalitarian when it came to the civil rights for African Americans. With General Rufus Saxton in charge of helping roughly 40,000 slaves gain title to the allocated land, the Freedmen's Bureau became established to help with that process. This event gave the precedent for what we are talking about right now. Another thing that made whites fear a possible insurrection was the rapidity at which the free black communities in the South organized, both politically and socially. Once free, African Americans quickly put together support systems for one another and garnered huge groups of people making speeches concerning freedom and how to move throughout society and politics. Whites watching these large groups of freedmen spring up all over cities and even rural areas sent a shiver down the spines of whites thinking about what could happen if they organized with violent intent. So why was Christmas the time believed for the rebellion? As historian Stephen Hahn stated, with work largely suspended and the reins of supervision loosened on the days between Christmas and New Year's, slaves moved relatively freely to visit family and friends on neighboring plantations and farms. There they staged their own rites of community, held their own dances and celebrations, and partook of the spirits and spirits. The tradition of gaining more freedom during the Christmas season made whites paranoid that former slaves would use that traditional time as the moment to spring their revolt and take even more freedoms than they had previously been allowed. This combined with the fact that the federal government led by Andrew Johnson was continually making it easier for former rebels to get back their land, and this restoration of the landscape was believed to be what would make freedmen rise up and take the land instead of waiting for the government. The panic spread throughout the South, and whites concocted stories of possible slave preparations for racial upheaval, like in Alabama, where a town convinced that freedmen were organizing and conducting military training a few miles outside of town was found out to simply be a prayer meeting. One of the most elaborate events comes in Meridian, Mississippi, where a local planter, after selling a large amount of cotton, went missing. Townspeople convinced themselves that the planter's former slaves had killed the man for selling their cotton. The citizens believed that the freedmen's insurrection plot to take over their old plantation was foiled when the planter sold the cotton, which they saw as theirs. Townspeople investigated the plantation and allegedly found dried blood and a freshly used shovel. They tortured 3 freedmen about the insurrection plot and the whereabouts of their former master, but they claimed to know nothing about it. The people were surprised when the planter was found, alive in a Meridian brothel, having spent the last 2 whole days inside the establishment, spending the money he had made off the sale of his cotton. Christmas came and went with no insurrection. But the fear was real, and for those freedmen hurt because of that fear, the insurrection had consequences, even though it was fabricated in the minds of white Southerners. Thank you all so much for watching. Please share the video and have a great holiday season, and I'll see you next week.